Hey, Keas here with my second installment, Unlocking the Kingdom. As you can see, I already have the HGs on for this one. For those of you who know me from Roguehead Huddle over at RGR Football, check them out. You'll know what the HGs are all about, the Horace Grants. So in today's episode, we're going to talk briefly about too high safety coverage that the Chiefs saw last year. And is this, or was this, in fact, the Chiefs' kryptonite? This episode is largely based on a series of tweets by Arjun Menon. And I'm so sorry if I pronounce that wrong. I will put a link in the description here to his Twitter, and you can follow him. Please do follow him. There's a lot of great accounts out there, but he tweeted about a week or so ago now, May 10th to be exact. He tweeted out this analytics about how like no other quarterback forces defenses to change the way that they play like Patrick Mahomes does. And so we have this graphic here, and I'll put it up here on the screen for you to look at. We have this graphic of 2021 defenses and the pre-snap too high looks that they showed. How much were they showing too high looks throughout the whole season, and how does that compare to when they played the Chiefs? How much did that frequency change? And so that's the basis of today's video, because as I studied this graphic, there were a good deal of things that popped out to me. So if you look at, and I will put on the screen as well here, you can see here, this is my augmented graphic. And I've went through and I put the win-loss record, so you can see clearly these are the teams the Chiefs beat. And, here's how this graphic applies to wins and losses. And when we look at this, you'll see, and it's maybe it's stunning to you, maybe it's not really surprising, maybe it fits the narrative that too high looks are the Chiefs' kryptonite. Who knows? Take it however you will. But in studying this, what I noticed is that the Chiefs didn't lose any games that they didn't face too high at least 70% or more of the time. Maybe 68, 69, 70. It was close to 70, like basically 70. If the team didn't play too high or show too high looks at least somewhere near 70% of the time, that team did not beat the Chiefs in 2021 season. Now, there were some ugly games on the schedule. There were some games where defenses clearly, without hitting that 70% threshold, where the defenses clearly held the Chiefs lower than their normal. But regardless, for whatever reason, and again, correlation is not causation, and I cannot stress that enough. Analytics are descriptive. They describe what happened. They're descriptive. They're not prescriptive. They don't make something happen. They won't tell you what will happen. They're descriptive. They can only tell you what did happen, right? There's never 100% certainty with these things. But of course, we still study history so that we can learn from it, so that we can make informed decisions that hopefully lead to better decisions and better success. So, no team that beat the Chiefs played too high or showed too high looks less than about 70% of the time. So, there is something there. You want to play the Chiefs, at least in 2021. If you wanted to win, you had to show too high looks around 70% or more of the time. Now, That said, as I said, it's not prescriptive. The Chiefs won 45.5% or so of the games they played when facing too high, 70% or more. They still won 45%, more than 45% of those games. If I recall correctly, there were 11 such games, and they won, I believe, 5 of them, and they lost 6 of them. After week 5, which was the Bills game, the Chiefs did not lose a game against too high safety when they saw it more than 75% in a game. So from after week 5, if a team showed the Chiefs too high safeties, 75% or more during the game, the Chiefs won those games. The Chiefs also increased their points scored by 16 points from their first meeting to their second meeting against a team playing too high 90% or more of the time. So in this case, we're talking about the Bills. From game 1 to the rematch game, the famous rematch game in the divisional game, 13 seconds, Reaper game, whatever you want to call it. In both matchups, the Bills played somewhere around 90% of the time. They were showing pre-snap too high looks. And between that first matchup and the second matchup, the Chiefs actually increased their offensive output by 16 points. Only the Titans managed to hold the Chiefs under 20 points in a game, showing around 70% too high safety looks in a loss. So in any of the games that this was the only time that the Chiefs lost a game, faced too high safety around 70% of the time, and were actually held under 20 points. Their other losses where they saw too high safety at least 70% of the time, they managed to score more than 20 points in a game. So the Titans had a better formula there because this loss was a pretty embarrassing loss for the Chiefs. To me, a good deal of that had to do with how disruptive Jeffrey Simmons was. And maybe to an extent, part of it was how raw Orlando Brown Jr. was in our system. And there were a lot of kinks between that and between Mahomes getting comfortable in a pocket with solid protection. There's probably a lot of things there, but that's the reality of it. Out of all of these teams, only the Packers and Cowboys managed to hold the Chiefs under 20 points in a game in a win. Now, this was the Packers and Cowboys showed too high between 48 and 65% of the time. Only between 48% and 65% of the time. If I recall correctly, the 48% was the Cowboys, and the 65% was the Packers. And so they didn't meet that 70% threshold. Now, of course, they didn't win those games, but they still were able to hold the Chiefs under 20 points in a game. Now, the Titans did it, and the Chiefs lost, but the Chiefs won these two against the Packers and the Cowboys. Still, the Packers and the Cowboys showed some kind of formula to decrease the Chiefs' offensive output that, while not as drastic as what the Titans did, was still as effective. They just weren't still able to pull out the win. Now, in the Cowboys' case, they had some injured receivers. They had some injured offensive linemen. And in the Packers' case, obviously, they were without Aaron Rodgers. So take that for, what you will. But those two teams were still able to hold the Chiefs to under 20 points without hitting that 70% pre-snap too high look threshold. Of all the teams that the Chiefs faced during the 2021 season, the Bills had the greatest difference between the average throughout the season, the average of how much they showed they were going to play too high, compared to what they changed it to when they faced the Chiefs. There was around a 35% increase in the too high pre-snap looks playing against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs compared to what they did on average throughout the season. That was the largest jump of any of the Chiefs' opponents from the 2021 season. Of all the teams the Chiefs played in 2021, they played 5 teams twice. Counting the playoffs, they played 5 teams twice. Out of those 5 teams, 2 actually decreased their too high usage from the first meeting to the second meeting. And that included our 2 divisional opponents here, in the Chargers and the Broncos. Strong defensive teams. Chargers and Broncos actually decreased their pre-snap too high looks from game 1 to game 2. Chargers went from around 88% in game 1 to around 79% in game 2. So about a 9% decrease, while the Broncos had a much more drastic decrease. They showed the too high in around 82% in game 1. And then in game 2, that dropped all the way down to 51%. Around a 31% drop from game 1 to game 2. 3 teams actually increased their too high usage after playing the Chiefs the first time. Again, you would know that one of those teams is going to be the only remaining AFC West opponent, which is the Raiders. The Raiders, the first game, they played too high 25% or so of the time. They stubbornly stuck to their system, and they got absolutely embarrassed. Game 2, they increased that up to 50%. They were still 20% or so away from that, we'll call it, better chance to win threshold that we saw from teams in 2021. So they doubled it from 25% to 50%, and they actually lost worse than they did in the first game. And then the other team on there were the Steelers and the Bengals. The Steelers increased from about 42% to 50% or so. So right there with the Raiders from game 1 to game 2. And again, they saw worse results as well. And then the Bengals increased from 70% to 75%. The Bengals were the only team to play the Chiefs more than once and still play at least 70% of the time in both matches. And they actually increased. The Bills, of course, played around 90% both times, but they didn't increase. If anything, there was a slight decrease by 1 or 2 or 3%, but they still stayed close to 90%. The Bengals didn't play quite that high. They stayed from 70%, they jumped up, but they stayed at that 70% threshold or better. They jumped up only about 5%, from 70% to 75%. You could possibly see the difference, between the Bills and the Bengals in that. Again, this is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. But still, it's kind of enlightening. And then the Broncos in Week 18 were the only team to play the Chiefs showing too high less than their season average. When the Broncos decreased from game 1 to game 2, and they decreased down to about 51% or so, that was actually below their season average, which is interesting. Again, field conditions may have played something into that, but that ended up being a fairly close game, regardless. Now, when we look at the Chiefs' averages, they averaged 22.8 points per game in their 6 losses, and 32.2 points per game in their 14 wins. Now, this isn't solely on the offense, because points per game isn't merely what the offense scores, right? You have to include defensive and special teams touchdowns in there as well, and other special teams points. But regardless, in their 6 losses, they only averaged 22.8 points per game, and in their 14 wins, they averaged 32.2 points per game. So we're looking at roughly a 10 points per game difference between their wins and their losses, which is something that they'll want to address. Now you might be thinking, what about when they faced too high? This is just overall, and that's right. When the Chiefs face too high, 70% or more, that threshold that I kind of set there, when other teams met that threshold on defense and the Chiefs saw too high 70% or more of the time, they averaged 26 points per game, which is about 3.2 points per game more than their average in their losses, which is kind of something serious to think about, right? Because in their wins, on average, they scored 32.2 points per game. Yet, when they face too high, 70% or more of the time, they only scored 26 points per game on average. When the Chiefs face too high, less than that 70% threshold, they actually scored on average 33.6 points per game. So when they didn't see too high, at least 70% of the time, their average was actually above their average output in their 14 wins. 33.6 versus 32.2. So almost a point and a half more just by facing too high, less than that 70% threshold. And this includes 36 plus points in 5 of 7 games where they faced too high less than 60% of the time. So when we lower that, forget 70%, let's drop it down to 60. When we drop it down to 60% or less, the Chiefs had 5 of 7 games that they played where they saw too high looks 60% or less of the time, and they scored at least 36 points in 5 of those 7. Denver and Dallas were the 2 that they failed to meet that 36 points. And so when they face too high, less than 50% of the time, if we bring it down even more, if they faced too high less than 50% of the time, they averaged 37.2 points per game. Now, you can draw whatever conclusion that you want to from these stats. But what is clear is that, one, if a team didn't show too high, for the most part, if a team didn't show too high at least 70% of the time, the Chiefs' offense was still rolling all over them. The Chiefs were still able to generate a good amount of points that they needed to win games. At the same time, if a team played the Chiefs twice and they didn't increase their too high looks from game 1 to game 2, the Chiefs' offense got stronger. The scoring output was greater from game 1 to game 2. There was a jump, regardless of how much too high was played. Remember, the Bills were around 90%, 90, 91, 92% or so, and they basically stayed there from game one to the divisional game, and they still lost. The Chiefs scored more points. The only opponent to beat them twice, of course, was the Cincinnati Bengals, who played them at least 70% both times and jumped up from game one to game two in the amount of two high looks that they showed. So you might conclude by looking at this that it is important for teams to play two high safety against the Chiefs. We'll see what that means for the Chiefs defense. Is there something that Steve Spagnuolo should have learned for his own building of our defense in 2022? What does that mean for the offense? What should that mean for Andy Reid's Tyreek Hill-less offense? And that'll be a question for another video. I want to thank you guys for joining me on this journey today as we looked back at the 2021 too high usage by other teams. Please subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. We'd love to have you as a backer. That's what we're calling our subscribers to the BAK channel here, is our backers. If you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing. Make sure you hit the bell notification and hit the like here. Share this with someone. If you look in the descriptions, you'll find a link to the Therese Paler Scholarship Foundation. You'll find a link to purchase one of these All Juice t-shirts. They also have hoodies if you want to go ahead and buy for this next winter. And don't forget to check out other Chiefs content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.